So I hear that you want to have an ego death. I feel like ego deaths are really hyped up right now in the psychedelic community. I see it at psychedelic meetups, on Reddit, and even on like documentaries like that new Netflix show. It's called Have a Good Trip or something like that. I think they also bring up ego death. And after that show, my friends who aren't as familiar with psychedelics messaged me asking me about it because, you know, it does sound pretty intimidating and scary. And I remember one time at a psychedelic meetup over a year ago now, someone asked us who has experienced ego death, raise your hand. I don't remember the context of it, but I had raised my hand. Then later, after the psychedelic meetup, you have like a mingling session, and then one guy came up to me and asked me about my ego death. You know, this guy had tried really hard to have an ego death. He took many large doses of psychedelics to try to achieve it, but no dice. So I shared with him my experience. My ego death happened on my first ever LSD trip over 4 years ago, and I took way too much LSD. I didn't realize at the time that I could not handle that. I've not taken that much LSD since. I'm like slowly working my way up to that, but I feel like, yeah, that was just way too much for me, and I didn't even know what an ego death was at the time. So what had happened was, you know, I took this, and I feel like looking back now, my ego was really fighting and resisting the ego death. The LSD was really trying to humble me down and impress that upon me, and it was just a battle between me and the LSD. So I don't know if you remember that scene from Game of Thrones where I try not to give spoilers, but when Arya and that girl are fighting and that girl's like, "You are nobody," and just says that over and over again.
Who were you before you came here? Arya Stark.
I feel like that was me and the LSD as well. The LSD was just beating my ass and telling me I was no one. It first started in the city that I was in. I was walking around, and then I started to not recognize what street I was on, and I was confused what part of the city I was in. And I have my journal entry from that trip. So I had said, I told the voice was the LSD, "Isn't this enough that I don't know where I am?" The voice said, "No, it's bad because you are still placing your place in relation to the world." So the beginning of that trip was pretty sinister, and it wasn't until I finally admitted that I was nobody and I knew nothing that I felt like relief, a wave washed over me. My journal says, "Then the sinister went away and I was left in beauty. Then I lost my sense of direction. And I didn't know where my trip buddy was at. I'm pretty sure he was still in the same room as me, but I had no idea where he was. I actually felt like he died, and then, you know, I didn't know what time of day it was. Then I sped through my past and my future, and then I, you know, was like sucking my thumb and stuff like that. And then I felt myself being forged into the rest of the world. I realized there was a duality, yes or no, light or dark, inside or outside, selfishness and selflessness. And these two dual forces spun around me and exploded, and I felt like I had experienced the birth and death of the universe." That was like the ego death part. And after that, the trip went a lot smoother and less sinister. But you know, that ego death part, I, you know, slightly remember it. I think there was that cliche white light that was part of it as well. But the thing about it is that because I had no sense of self or had no way to really construct thoughts or ideas, I didn't really take anything out of it, and that's what I didn't like about the ego death. I came into this trip really hoping to make some realizations and epiphanies about my life, and then I was just left with this experience of ego death, which was, you know, I appreciate that I had it and it was a really unique experience, but it gave me an appreciation for the oneness and all of that source stuff. But that was pretty much it. And I feel like those kinds of lessons I learned and even solidified even more better in other lower dose trips. So The day after that trip, I was supposed to be studying. I was in the library and I was just looking up what the fuck did I just experience, and then I came across the term ego death and I was like, holy shit, this totally describes what I had experienced very closely. So that's why I think that that was ego death. But you know, I feel like people have such a hard-on in a way for this ego death, but I don't necessarily think that the ego is good or bad or that it should die at all. So pour paintings are kind of like a metaphor, I guess, for how I see the universe in a way. So let's imagine each color here represents like a soul. I don't know a better word for that, but yeah, it's kind of like our ego. So with pour painting, one thing is like you mix the acrylic paint with something else like water or dish soap, or I can't pronounce this other paint mixer thing, but it's really important to get the ratios right because you run the risk of making the paint too watery or too thick. And when your paint is too watery, what happens is that when you put it on the canvas, all the paints mix in with each other and they make a color. They make like the same color, usually some grayish, brownish color. And not to say that that's ugly necessarily, but it's pretty boring. So if you have the right amount of thickness, or you know, your ego is strong enough, and then you mix the colors together, then you turn out with something that is really beautiful and diverse. And I feel like that's how it's like in the world too, you know. Our egos are, you know, neither good or bad, but one of the good things about it is that it gives us a way to remember, and it gives us a sense of identity, which helps us pass along information to other people, even down generations. And it also gives a really beautiful diversity to life as well. And so that's why I think, you know, the ego is not necessarily something that should be killed. And I love my ego and I appreciate it, but you know, there's also the other side of it where ego can be too bad, but I think mine is at a healthy spot right now. I'm not going to tell you not to pursue an ego death. I'm sure it's a totally, you know, for a lot of people that has been a really meaningful experience to them. But I do hope you take some of the things that I've said into consideration, and as always, I hope that you stay safe and responsible and definitely treat these substances with respect. But you know, you could get ego death through different ways, like through meditation, so it doesn't necessarily have to be through these like psychedelic substances. Alright, till next time.